Okay, I think hopefully I'm not going to have any video problems here or technical problems. So I'm doing the bit that the question you've all been waiting to ask because we get it all the time. When will the U.S. turn into a modern day Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe? First of all, I want to acknowledge that there's been some excellent work done on this by one of my colleagues, Rob Parento. We've written a lot of stuff together. I know he wanted to be here today, but he wrote a very good piece on Weimar. He writes the Rickenbacker letter, www.rickenbacker.com, and he wrote a very good piece on Weimar, which first started to make a very good historical comparison. So I'm indebted to him, and as far as Zimbabwe goes, Bill Mitchell has done, well, Bill always does very, very good work, but he did a particularly good piece on Zimbabwe for hyperventilators. So, like Minsky, who said he was standing on the shoulders of giants when he talked about Keynes, I say the same thing about Rob and Bill and Randy and all the other people on this panel. So I'm just the hack by comparison. So, will the U.S. turn into a modern-day Germany, Weimar Germany? So, let's start. I know some of this is we've gone through it before, but I'm going to start with a few operational points that have already been made to show that we're not the only ones making this. I've got quotes here from an economist called Abba Lerner. He's often known as the father of functional finance. He was a Keynesian, and I would think it's fair to say that he's one of the progenitors of the or forebears of modern monetary theory. So his comment, and it's Warren gave you an illustration of this before. He said the modern state can make anything it chooses generally acceptable as money. It is true that a simple declaration, as Warren showed you, that such and such money will not do, even if backed by the most convincing constitutional evidence of the state's absolute sovereignty. But if the state is willing to accept the proposed money in payment of taxes and other obligations to itself, the trick is done. Oh, sorry, take that. There we go. Rather appropriate, actually. Stuck in the middle of these. So, the other point, we've talked about the purpose of taxes. We've said they serve to regulate aggregate demand, not to raise money, so that government can afford to spend. And again, the other idea that I think was a very important insight by Lerner is that he said that the central idea is that government fiscal policy, it's spending and it's taxing, it's borrowing, it's repayments of loans, it's issue of new money, etc., should be undertaken with an eye only to the results of these actions on the economy and not to any established traditional doctrines of what is sound or unsound. So we look at the impact of policy, the effects of policy. That's ultimately what we're looking at. We're not particularly interested in some vague notion of a debt to GDP ratio, which is considered unsustainable, or the general concept of fiscal unsustainability. The constraint, as we've said, is inflation. It's not fiscal largesse or fiscal profligacy per se. And I often do this. Lynn Paramore, they were saying, what sort of visual cues do you have? I often do this at a conference. I say, here's two pieces of paper. This is one with a picture of a dead president on it. This is just a piece of paper. This one, they tell you, is worth $1. And this one is probably worth about 3 cents. Now, I tell people that if I told you tomorrow that this piece of paper could be used as something with which you could pay your taxes, I suspect it would be worth a lot more to you than the 3 cents or whatever it is that you use to pay your taxes. So when we talk about this being backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, what we're really saying is, that the U.S. government guarantees that you could use these pictures of dead presidents, which aren't backed by anything. There's no gold nuggets in it. There's no, it's not rimmed by platinum or any precious metal. So you can use this basically to pay your taxes, and that's what confers the value on it. Okay, let's go into the history lesson. So when we look at Weimar, let's take a step back. When we talk about these operational realities that I've mentioned earlier, invariably, I can tell you 9 times out of 10, if you look at the Huffington Post blog yesterday, we get comments saying, well, you're just going to hyperinflate, you're going to turn this country into a modern-day Weimar Germany. So I heard this so many times, and so did Rob, that we decided to actually look at the history. Now, clearly, Weimar Germany came into existence after World War I. It was a very damaging war. hugely more damaging in many respects than World War II. The country's productive capacity, a large chunk of it was absolutely shattered. And more importantly, virtually the entire world was very pissed off with Germany. So as a result, the war reparations claims that they imposed on the country were extremely punitive. Many people at the time, such as Keynes, for example, realized that this would pose tremendously harsh economic consequences on Germany, and that the imposition itself was virtually going to be impossible to be repaid. As I say here, in 1919, it was reported that the German budget deficit was equal to half GDP. Half GDP. And what are you talking about in the US today? We're talking about 8% of GDP. I think it may have peaked at 10%, and that's including TOP. So, let's get a sense of perspective here. By 1921, in Germany, war reparations payments represented 1/3 of government spending. 1/3. So, I think that's an important consideration to look at. And I think more importantly is that the payments were demanded in a foreign currency. They weren't being demanded in Deutschmarks. They were being demanded in gold. The governments demanded huge gold reparations. Now, by contrast, as I said, in the U.S., you've got a fiscal deficit this year. I think it's projected. I think the latest I looked at the CBO, it's about 8.5% of GDP, assuming that GDP is what everyone thinks it will be. So the scale of the fiscal responses, although large, are nothing like what they were in Weimar Germany. So there's a big difference right there. Weimar Germany then didn't have the gold, so they had to aggressively sell their own currency, buy the foreign currency in the financial markets. You keep doing that over and over again, drives down the value of your own currency, which causes the price of goods to go ever higher, and that starts the inflationary process. As I said earlier, the U.S. does not do this. The U.S. is to use debt in its own free-floating, non-convertible currency. You can't exchange the dollar into anything, much as some people would like that. So there's no external constraint along the same lines as Weimar Germany. Now, I've also made this point here about German trade union membership. I am not making the point that unionization is a bad thing, that unionization causes inflation, and that we shouldn't have unionization. In fact, I think if we had more unions in this country and stronger unions, it would actually be better. My point really here is that you had a very, very significantly larger union membership in Weimar Germany than you do in the U.S., and they had considerably more political power than in the U.S. You had a social democratic government, which was by and large very ideologically sympathetic to union. But more importantly, and this is a point that Bill Mitchell made earlier, unions were able to negotiate cost of living adjustments in their wage packages after the mark fell in 1929. So this creates this automatic feedback mechanism from price inflation to wage hikes, and it keeps going on and on and on. If you build these cost of living adjustments into wage contracts, of course, you can feed the inflation almost automatically. We don't have that in the U.S. Absent such mechanisms in the U.S., or any country for that matter, nominal wage and salary growth can't keep up with consumer prices. So ultimately, the impact, if you don't do that, is deflationary. If the price of oil and food and everything else starts going up in the U.S., and your wage packages are not indexed to that in any particular way, your purchasing power is ultimately going to go down. So you have to defer consumption, expenditure in other areas to meet the cost to buy these essentials. As I say, that's potentially deflationary, not hyperinflationary. Now, the U.S., as I say here, does display some social democratic rhetoric, but as Warren has already pointed out, this administration, despite being an ostensibly progressive democratic administration, has presided over one of the most regressive wealth transfers in history. It's amazing to me that it's happened and that it's been allowed to happen, but that's the reality. And it could have been worse if we had allowed some of these abominable programs like PPIP to go ahead, which fortunately we didn't do. So what finally broke down Weimar Germany at the end, the straw that broke the camel's back, was that in May 1921, the so-called London Ultimatum, the Germans were asked to make an annual installment in payments of $2 billion in gold or foreign currency, in addition to a claim on just over a quarter of the value of German exports. So, an extremely punitive measure, It was a condition virtually impossible to fulfill. The Germans attempted to fulfill it. They accumulated foreign exchange by paying with treasury bills and commercial debts denominated in marks, but the mark simply went into free fall. So they finally said, we can't pay up anymore. You're seeing a small parallel with that today in Greece. It's not to the same degree, but obviously it's as usual. It's the positions are reversed. It's the Germans imposing conditions on the Greeks, saying, you have to pay X, even though the Greeks don't have the money. So they're trying to get blood out of a stone. But we don't clearly have hyperinflation in Greece. Is an interesting parallel. So the response to that was that the French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr to secure reparation payments. The problem was that the Ruhr was one of the industrial powerhouse regions of Germany, and they employed about a quarter of their workforce in that area. And they exported a huge amount from that area. So effectively, you take away their a large chunk of the manufacturing capacity is eliminated to begin with. Then you occupy a chunk of the country which has a huge portion of what's left of manufacturing capacity, and then you say, now pay us the money, and you can see why a central bank printing money in that situation or creating currency in that situation is not going to be able to do so, won't be able to call forth goods and services, and you do create the conditions for inflation and then hyperinflation. So again, it's a very, very different situation from what we have today in the US. Now, the modern day example that everyone likes to go to with Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, as you well know, it had a civil war even before Mugabe took over. It was a long-lasting civil war. I mean, it lasted throughout most of the 60s and 70s, low-intensity guerrilla warfare, but ultimately became much more serious, to the point where ultimately there was an accord brokered by the British government, and in 1980 President Mugabe became the new leader of the country in a coalition government. But by that point, a large chunk again of the country's productive capacity had been destroyed even before the onset of the land reform. Now, this just gives you an illustration where there was some recovery. Zimbabwe, as you can see, did all right after Mugabe first came in. You had reasonably high growth, 11% in 1980, and it was positive throughout most of the decade of the 1980s until you had a severe drought in the early 1990s, which created great damage. But again, there was a recovery from that. So even though we had some problem with the productive capacity, the economy was growing. So what was it that ultimately caused the problems in Zimbabwe? Well, you have the legacy of colonialism. I used to have a girlfriend in Zimbabwe many moons ago when I was at university, and I remember visiting the country in 1982, and I thought, God, life is hell for these white farmers, because they lived in these absolutely gorgeous palatial mansions. They had loads of staff working for them. There wasn't apartheid as such, but you had a very, very a cushy lifestyle. 250,000 whites basically controlled over 70% of the most productive agriculture in the country out of a nation of 6 million people. So that's clearly a socially unsustainable situation. There were many attempts by the government to coax the white farmers into giving up a little then in order to make for a more equitable situation later, and there was no give. As an aside, I think we talk a lot about income inequality in this country, and to me, it is if it's not something that's addressed in a decent amount of time, you do get a huge socially unsustainable situation, which will get an even more extreme political response later. So I think it is in that regard the situation of what's happened in Zimbabwe in terms of the misguided reforms that were subsequently introduced. It's a legacy of the fact that we didn't deal with the problem of inequality much earlier in that country. So what happens? Mugabe begins his land reform program. It's a misguided land reform program. He seizes land from the whites, gives it to his cronies in the ZANU party. Unfortunately, many of them don't have a farming expertise, and not surprisingly, agricultural production in the country absolutely collapses. It collapses by almost 50%. The country then finds itself in a situation where, if in order to avoid mass starvation, it has to use valuable foreign exchange reserves in order to import imported food. That creates an additional problem. You don't have foreign exchange to pay for raw materials, so manufacturing capacity absolutely collapses. And the end result is that you have about 80% unemployment. Now here's the statistics. I got this again from Bill Mitchell. Output fell by 29%. Manufacturing output fell by 29% in 2005, 18% in 2006, 28% in 2007. It's worse than what you had in Latvia over the last few years. Again, though, self-inflicted. So you have no foreign currency to buy raw materials. The Bank of Zimbabwe uses foreign reserves to import food. And as Bill has pointed out in his blog, the land reform destroys domestic food production. Foreign exchange is used to buy food to prevent starvation, because I guess even as cruel as that government was, Mr. Mugabe didn't think that it would be a good idea to allow mass starvation in order to bring supply and demand back together again. So you have no funds left to import raw materials, and manufacturing output collapses. You have 80% unemployment. The government, in the meantime, uses, Mr. and Mrs. Mugabe use the foreign exchange reserves for their personal shopping expeditions to London. They and in general, the government uses the foreign exchange reserve, what's left of them, to increase net spending without adding to productive capacity. So it's effectively used as a personal piggy bank. Same thing happened, for example, in the Philippines when the Marcos family was in power. You basically just steal what's left in the piggy bank and use it for your own good. So it's a totally dysfunctional situation you have there, and obviously, again, you could argue that this country does suffer from some political dysfunction, but I think we would agree that, at least not yet, it's not quite as bad as Zimbabwe, and so I think that the analogy is the wrong one. So there are other examples of this. The loss of taxing authority during the Civil War by the Confederacy is another example of a situation where a government's inability to impose a tax ultimately did create hyperinflationary conditions. So political dysfunction and the inability to tax is an extremely important means of safeguarding the value of a currency. But in general, as I said, despite what you might hear from the propagandists on the right, actually you hear it on the right, left, center, almost from everybody, there is no valid basis of comparison between the US and Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe. Any bad government can wreck an economy if it wants to. That's quite evident. A sensible government using the fiscal capacity provided by a fiat monetary currency system can always generate full employment and yet sustain price stability. Now, I know we're going to be talking about this later, but one of the things I'd like to talk about briefly is productive capacity. We talk about calling forth productive capacity, and as a few people have mentioned earlier, the most effective means of calling forth productive capacity is by ensuring that you have a productive labor force. And one of the means by which you ensure that you have a productive labor force is by establishing a government job guarantee program, which I think will be discussed at greater length later. But the point is that if you have a government that has shovel-ready labor, ready to be piled back into the private sector when private sector demand arises. Not only is this good social policy, but it actually it means that you do create non-inflationary conditions, because it means you are effectively retaining productive capacity which can be used. If you have long-term unemployed, the social pathologies build up, and you actually these type of workers lose their productivity. So in fact, even though you might have significant output gaps via unemployment, if you have long-term unemployment, it can potentially create difficulties if you don't have these people in a position where they can actually bring something back into the economy as a whole. So I think that's an important conclusion to draw as well. The other point I would make, which also comes up a lot in these discussions, Warren and I have had these discussions about people, and they talk about Greece, Portugal, and they talk about the U.S. spending money, and they say, eventually you're going to default on your debt, and we both probed them on this question. We say, well, what do you mean by default? Do you mean that the U.S. is somehow going to, Social Security checks are going to start to bounce, or that we're not going to make a payment to a bondholder? They go, no. What we mean by that is that the currency is going to fall so much that you're going to get huge amounts of inflation, and therefore that is tantamount to insolvency. We've had this debate, let's see, with Carolyn Baum at Bloomberg. We've had this debate with Martin Wolf at the Financial Times. Charles Goodhart has even said the same thing. He's a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. The only point I've made to these people is that if you buy a credit default swap in a country like the U.S., Germany, any country, in fact, you don't get paid out if they run a rate of inflation. It would be nice. I mean, I'd love to. I'd buy credit default swaps in every single country that I could find, actually, because anytime they run an inflation, any rate of inflation, I can get paid. But clearly, that's not the way that we define default. So again, misleading terminology, misleading historical examples. You can always call people on that, and I think we should do so much more aggressively in the future. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.